All right, let's move forward. We talked yesterday about the beginning of the Great War, or World War I. Let's talk about the fighting of the Great War. So as our Zeppelin goes across the screen, fighting the Great War. So in this section, we'll talk about how trench warfare led to a stalemate on the Western Front in Europe of the war. We'll also identify and describe the impact of modern military technology, so new weaponry in the fighting. We'll look at the course of the war on multiple European fronts, in Europe, also on the Eastern Front. And finally, we'll explain how World War I was a global conflict and how what was the Great War becomes known as a World War. First thing to talk about, how and where was World War I fought? As we'll see in more detail, new weapons in this war, tanks, airplanes, and submarines are going to change forever the way that war is fought. In addition, kind of a unique situation in the Western Front, a stalemate created by digging in, quite literally, trenches, made this the deadliest conflict in the world in history at this time. Initially, it was called the Great War. It wasn't called World War I because there hadn't been a second one yet. But initially, it was called the Great War. The war to end all wars is another name it would get later. But it was called a World War because even though it was fought primarily in Europe, it spreads to the colonies in Asia and the Middle East as well. Whether they're fighting in those areas, certainly soldiers from those areas are fighting, or supplies are being generated to support the war effort. First concept I want us to understand is this idea of total war. So when we talk about a total war, what that really means is that all the resources of a country are pulled together in order to fight this war. It doesn't mean that just a few men are off or fighting. It means that every resource under the control of the government and the people are dedicated toward fighting. So as a result of total war in Europe, the countries mobilized an incredible number of men. So just look at these numbers. France mobilized 8.5 million men to fight. Britain, 9 million men, and think about how small Britain is. Russia, 12 million soldiers, and Germany, 11 million soldiers. So a significant number of men going off to fight, and many of them to die in World War I. This quote here at the bottom is significant as well, something to think about. 1 out of every 4 men who went out to World War did not come back. And of those who did came back, many were maimed and blind, and some were mad. If you think about it, we now are able to diagnose things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. These things weren't understood back in the time. So many people came back maybe with no visible injuries, but with some significant emotional and mental damage. So a devastating, devastating war. In the end of the previous section, we talked about Germany's Schlieffen Plan. So the Schlieffen Plan, where the German army marched through Belgium in order to attack France very quickly. The Schlieffen Plan, and you can see it diagrammed here on the map, ultimately did not fail. So what is the Schlieffen Plan? Well, the goal with the Schlieffen Plan was to get a quick victory in the West while Russia was still getting ready, and thus avoid having to fight a war on two fronts. So think about geographically where Germany is in Europe. And to its east, it has Russia. To its west, it has France and Great Britain. So the Schlieffen Plan, in order to not have to fight on both sides, east and west of your country, was to very quickly knock France and the eastern or the western front out of the war so that they could focus their concerns, their resources on a single enemy, that being Russia in this case. Well, that was the plan with the Schlieffen Plan. Unfortunately for Germany, it didn't work out that way for several reasons, actually. Number one, Russia mobilized much more quickly, so they were able to fight much more quickly than Germany expected on the Eastern Front. In response, German generals had to pull back and shift some of their troops from fighting in the west to fighting in the east to go fight the Russians. Also, British troops mobilized a little more quickly than expected. They joined French troops fighting in Northern Europe, which made a quick, almost surprise victory from Germany over France impossible. So on the Western Front, Germany fighting British and French troops. Both sides digging in, quite literally digging trenches for protection, creating along that battle line a stalemate on the Western Front. Neither side was able to get a significant advantage. And you can see this looks like the Allied side of the trenches here. Men ate, lived, slept, and occasionally died and attacked from these trenches. So you have the Allied trenches on one side, you have the German trenches on the other side. The area between those two trenches is called no man's land. It's full of barbed wire. If there was an attack where the troops would, as you see in this picture, jump over the top and try to attack the enemy across no man's land, oftentimes they were just shot down with machine guns. So no man's land was not necessarily a place that you wanted to go. Each side would launch attacks and counterattacks. You might gain a few hundred yards only to lose it back the next day. No one was able to get an advantage in the trench warfare that happened on the Western Front. So millions of soldiers on both sides, the Central Powers and the Allies, ate, slept, died, everything in these trenches. There's a video that I'm going to assign to you as well that gives you a little more of an example what it was like in these trenches. And some of these trenches were better than others, but any life in this trench, any amount of time spent in these trenches was pretty horrific. If you've seen the movie War Horse, which I would recommend, you get a sense of what life in the trenches was like. So how was the battle fought? Well, we have new weapons that make the fighting even more deadly here in the 1900s. In some battles, hundreds of thousands were killed just in the span of one battle. So what are the weapons? Rapid fire machine guns, more sophisticated, more rounds per second. If someone jumps up into no man's land, they were just mowed down very quickly. So machine guns. Long-range artillery guns. So now you could have guns such as you see here behind the lines fire these big artillery shells across no man's land into the trenches of the enemy or into the town or other fortifications of the enemy, often miles away. Another weapon that was introduced in World War I was poison gas, mustard gas. Now, it wasn't necessarily deadly because once people figured out what it was, standard issue for soldiers were gas masks. But if it caught you by surprise, it could cause a problem. Many injuries, many fatalities as well. But one of the problems, as the text mentions as well, with using a poisonous gas was you might launch it and it might explode, but then if the wind shifts, that gas is blown back into your own troops. So not the most perfect weapon, but certainly one that was used and one that caused a good amount of damage in the war. Other technologies changed where battles were fought, from the ground to the air to being underwater. So tanks are a technology that's introduced in World War I. So tanks, the British were the first to use tanks. They have the advantage to be armor protected somewhat so they could go across no man's land. Well, the problem is in the early stages at least, they were very unreliable and they would often break down. So imagine if you're going across no man's land toward the enemy's trenches and your tank decides not to work anymore. You're kind of stuck out there. So they were introduced, they made some impact. They're going to be improved significantly before we get to the Second World War, but nonetheless, a significant weapon. Zeppelins or blimps. For the most part, Zeppelins were used to observe where the enemy had troops, where the enemy was moving troops, so primarily for observation. Early on, the Germans did float some Zeppelins across the English Channel and very primitively drop some bombs on London and surrounding areas, but as you can imagine, slow-moving blimp, very easy target to fire against or into. That didn't last very long, but for the most part, observation was what Zeppelins were used for. Airplanes were introduced. We talked about the Wright brothers in 1904. Well, we're 10 years later. We've got a little more sophisticated airplanes, and we had these dogfights, the Red Baron and other aces who would battle in the skies, but primarily smaller planes. Very dramatic, certainly, but didn't necessarily have a big change in the outlook of the war. Any kind of bombs that were dropped were just ones dropped by hand out of the cockpit. So again, for the most part, airplanes were for observation. Probably the most devastating weapon that's introduced in World War I are submarines or U-boats, and the Germans were the first to employ these. So primitive submarines, very basic in nature. They could slip under the water. They could torpedo ships that were carrying supplies to the Allies. One of the ways that the Allies countered that was they would send ships together so they weren't spread out across the ocean and try to protect them with other ships around. But the submarines were devastating to the supply chain and very successful against Allied forces. On the Eastern Front, so we're moving to the east to the border of Austria and Germany with Russia. So Eastern Front's a little bit different. Casualties are significantly high and quite possibly even higher, especially on the Russian end. And the outcome is just as indecisive. So on the Eastern Front, we've got Russian troops mobilized and fighting against German troops and Austro-Hungarian troops. We don't see trench warfare in the East. Trench warfare is primarily going to be in the West, in Northern Europe. So no trench warfare, so you do have significant shifts in where the battlefront is going to be. Several miles back and forth. It's going to be much larger territories that are taken and then given up, and they're going to shift just as greatly. Russia's going to suffer in World War I significant losses. Now, if you remember when we talked about Russia, we've always described them as being a little behind the rest of Europe in terms of industrialization, in terms of some aspects of culture. Well, in this period of time in World War I, Russia is not as industrialized as the European nations. So oftentimes, yes, they've got millions of men to send into battle, but they don't always have the supplies to send with them, whether it's rifles or bullets or extra boots or things like that. So they're going into battle very poorly equipped. But they're being sent out anyway, and as a result, they're suffering significant casualties. So the significant losses that the Russians suffer in the early parts of World War I are going to have an impact, as we'll see a little bit later, because that's going to be frustrating for the people back in Russia, and we're going to end up having a revolution. So we had the Western Front, we have the Eastern Front. We're also going to have fighting in the Balkans and Southern Europe early in the war in 1915. In the Balkans, we're talking about, if you look at the map here, down there where you see Bulgaria and Serbia in that area. So in the Balkans, Southern Europe, we've got Bulgaria joining the side of the Central Powers against Serbia, who's a member of the Allies. We've got Romania joining the Allies fighting against Hungary. We've got Italian troops who actually switch sides. If you remember in the beginning, Italy initially was one of the Central Powers. Well, there was a secret deal with Great Britain where Italy agreed to change sides to go to the Allies in exchange for some Austrian land that Italy was supposed to get after the war. So Italy changes side to the Allies, but unfortunately for the Italians, they were not necessarily very effective in their fighting, so they needed some help from the British and from the French in order to protect their territory. But nonetheless, the Italians do switch sides. One of the big questions once the war started was which side was the Ottoman Empire going to join? Well, the Ottoman Empire decided to side itself with the Central Powers early in the war in October 1914, and very quickly they cut off a vital supply line that the Allies were using to get supplies to Russia. So if you remember, the Ottoman Empire, the capital was right there in Istanbul. So they control the Bosphorus Straits, and as you can see further down at the other end, they also control the Dardanelles. So the Allies wanted to, once the Ottoman Empire had declared it was going to side with the Central Powers, it wanted to free up this channel to get supplies to Russia, free up the Dardanelles. So they sent significant forces to a place there called Gallipoli, trying to defeat the Ottomans and open up the Black Sea and the Mediterranean to get supplies to the Russians. Well, the Allies suffer significant defeat at Gallipoli, and they finally withdrew after more than 200,000 men were injured or killed. Within the Ottoman Empire, there are problems as well, and this should remind you of something we talked about in the imperialism unit. Armenian Christians, so Turkish Armenians, living as we've talked about within the Ottoman Empire. They were Christian, they weren't Muslim. They sided and they had more in common with the Russians, so they were siding with the Russians. As a result, the Ottomans massacred, deported, put into camps, forced to march to different territories, and starved the Armenian Christians. So we talked a little bit about the Armenian genocide that happened during this time at the hands of the Ottomans or the Turkish government. Elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, going south just a little bit, down there toward Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, we had Arabs within the Ottoman Empire rising up against the Ottomans. Again, nationalism, looking to break away from the Ottoman Empire. So this Arab uprising in the Middle East, the British latch on to that. They send a British officer, T.E. Lawrence, to help pull together the Arab resistance, the Arab nationalists, to fight the Ottomans. T.E. Lawrence is going to become very famous for his efforts, and he becomes Lawrence of Arabia, a name you might have heard before. Again, another very good movie, Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole. I would recommend that at some point. So fighting against the Ottoman Empire in the Arabian Peninsula with the support of the British, led by T.E. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia. As we mentioned, most of the fighting's in Europe, but it does become a global conflict. In 1914, Japan joins on the side of the Allies, declaring war on Germany, and I think a lot of historians look at this as very opportunistic. So Japan had its own imperialist intentions, as we talked about in the last unit, but this would also be an excuse for them to grab those German colonies, those German outposts in China and elsewhere in the Pacific for Japanese control. As we know, Japanese advancements in East Asia and elsewhere in the Pacific are going to continue through the period of World War I and continue after World War I is over. And eventually, these very ambitious, aggressive Japanese leaders are going to reach a little too far. And it's going to cause some problems, not only with the United States, but with others as well. So we're still in the age of colonialism. So the European colonies throughout the world contributed as well. Oftentimes they would send troops to fight. So you had Indian troops, sepoys, fighting for the British in Europe, in other parts of the world. You had Canadian troops that went over and fought with the British, Australian troops, French troops fighting in West Africa and also in Europe. So troops from the colonies fighting in support of the colonial power. And the hope really was for people from Australia, India, New Zealand, and elsewhere in French West Africa was that if they do this, once the war is over, they might gain some more independence. They might gain some self-determination, or they might gain the ability to control, be more autonomous and control their own government. All right, that wraps up the fighting of the Great War. We're going to continue with this in the next section.